This video is sponsored by DoorDash. Ridley Scott is known for his fiery personality, from getting into it with interviewers.
F you, thank you very much. F you, go f yourself. Go on. So, go on.
To getting into arguments with Harrison Ford over Blade Runner.
Harrison and I fell out only because I was the new kid on the block in Hollywood, and I had never shot in Hollywood before, so that was my first film. So I became very bad-tempered during the making of that, as did he.
It's just a movie. Let him worry about it.
And that argument still continues decades later. But one aspect of this generational director has perhaps evaded the notice of even the most ardent fans: his penchant for fire. Join us as we take a look at the director's pyromaniac run as a director, from exploding one of the largest sound stages in the world to burning down an entire forest. And throughout this video, discover if Ridley Scott truly wants to watch the world burn. We don't have to look too far into Ridley Scott's directorial career to get the first instance of his love for destruction through fire. In his second film, Ridley Scott ditched the concept of souped-up sci-fi guns like the ones in Star Wars and instead opted to use a flamethrower in Alien.
All right, I raced.
This choice to use a flamethrower is absolutely iconic for this film and is repeated through the multiple Alien sequels. But it was also a risky choice considering their set.
Everything was so claustrophobic on that set. I mean, that is one of those sets where you walked in and there's the engine room. Well, that's fine. But connected to that is the corridor. Connected to that was the cafeteria. Connected to that was the hospital. It was all connected, the ship. So once you were on, you were on. You had to go through everything in order to get off.
The entire set for the Nostromo was one large set, all built with interconnecting hallways throughout the ship. Just to get around or get out, the actors would have to travel through mazes of corridors. This added a great sense of claustrophobia to the film and the compositional choices for the cinematographer.
There is no escape. That is one of the bases of the real tension of the film.
And it really comes across that way in the movie. But while this is integral to the film, it poses a problem when it comes to safety. And we're talking about a film made in the 70s, of course, in an era where safety was not always a priority in filmmaking. Asbestos was used in racing helmets in Le Mans in 1971. The Exorcist would give both actors Ellen Bernstein and Linda Blair severe back injuries. And only a few years later, after Alien in 1983, 2 children and the lead actor were killed by a helicopter crashing into them, even after multiple warnings from the pilot about his concerns about safety, and of course the director sneaking the children in to act outside of regulated working hours. All this to say, the Alien set was by no means safe, with things like spacesuits not having cooling or ventilation in them during a heat wave, causing the actors to almost pass out, or using smoke effects without a water base to them.
Of course, our first day of shooting, and all of the things start popping, and there was smoke, so much smoke, it was unbelievable. The canisters were going, and the smoke was being pumped in because we're supposed to be on fire as we're crash landing into this strange planet. I'm surprised none of us are dead. I mean, they didn't have codes like here. They have to have a water base, which took a long time for them to get, but over there, it was like smelt pots.
The set was not necessarily the safest place to be, and add a flamethrower into a crowded, maze-like, claustrophobic set, and you can see the problem. The flamethrowers they were using were built to be turned on remotely with a D battery that would create the pilot light. And of course, in line with how Ridley Scott would light many scenes throughout his career, the light on the flamethrower created the perfect way to practically light the scene in a cramped space, meaning that they would leave the flame lit after they turned it on. And reportedly, Ridley Scott liked to keep it that way. Veronica Cartwright, who played Lambert in the film, talked about this in a panel discussion at the Texas Frightmare in 2013. One aspect she talked about was what parts of the set, like the space jockey, were made with, saying one of the reasons they had to shoot it over in England was because of the materials that you could use. And one of them was that it was built primarily out of styrofoam. And then of course everything was over the top of it, when it was illegal in America to use that, because of being a fire hazard. Though we see multiple characters use the flamethrower throughout the film, it's actually in the deleted scene where Ripley mercifully ends the life of Dallas, who has essentially been cocooned in by the alien. Veronica Cartwright, again in that same panel discussion, talked in great detail about this scene, saying they had sent Sigourney out to learn how to use the flamethrower. So she goes out and she practices behind the studio in this big grass lot. That thing threw flames 20 feet. I mean, it was just unbelievable. So then when they had the death scene set up, it was Tom sitting up. He's got webs all over him. And Ridley said, "Fire the gun." At which point the crew member from special effects goes, "Cut, cut." If she'd have hit that, every one of those crew members and everyone standing behind those cameras, including her, would have been a crisp. When you think of the disaster that could have happened, it is so scary, but it brought a new tension to the scene. Now, whether or not this story nearly 35 years later was embellished or not is impossible to say. But based on all the other circumstances we listed, we can comfortably say it was probably a miracle in a sense that this set didn't catch on fire at one point or another. But Ridley Scott wasn't as lucky in his future film in 1985. There it was. I had just sat down after editing this section to watch a Ridley Scott film I was going to cover on later in this video. But I quickly realized that, like most of his films, it was really long and I was getting very hungry. But thanks to our sponsor, DoorDash.
Are you talking to me?
You are actually talking to yourself. We are forcing you to do an internal monologue just like the studios forced Harrison Ford and Ridley Scott to do for Blade Runner.
I didn't know how long we'd have together. Who does?
The audiences will love it, but the really good news is that you, or I, don't have to stop that really long Ridley Scott movie to make dinner. I can get it delivered with DoorDash. And I was remembering that this on-demand food delivery app can deliver a meal, flowers, groceries, or even some tissues for the sad parts of the film right to your door.
Why am I telling this to myself? I use DoorDash all the time when I'm editing a video or watching a really, really long movie like this one. They've got almost every type of food to choose from right there in the app. I get food delivered to my door almost every week. So why am I talking to myself in this really, really bad internal monologue?
Well, it's to tell our viewers about the special offer DoorDash has just for them. DoorDash is your door to more. Download the DoorDash app now to get almost anything delivered, and using the code Voyager 2024, get 50% off up to $10 on your first order of $15 or more. Now back to this really, really long Ridley Scott movie.
I am darkness.
Ridley Scott.
After Ridley Scott's work on the pre-production for the film Dune was halted, a film that would eventually be finished by David Lynch, he was looking for another story to film and decided he wanted to do a film on some mythological tale. This resulting in one of the most curious Ridley Scott films in legend.
What is innocence? What is purity? What is corruption?
Look, ugly one-horned mule.
For this film, Ridley Scott wanted to build a forest, and not just a small one, but a massive one.
I was completely gobsmacked to see that set for the first time. The scale, the actual grand scale of everything was sort of absurd. I mean, I know that there are films done on that scale now, but it was just awesome, unbelievable, like an entire forest in a soundstage.
To build a set this large, one needs a ton of space, and Ridley Scott would pick one of the largest and most famous sound stages, the 007 stage in Shepperton Studio. This stage at the time had 45,400 square footage with a height of 70 feet, and Ridley Scott made use of every square inch of it. It would take 14 weeks to build this set, with trees reaching a maximum height of 40 to 60 feet.
And the set was very high. It was built like in a miniature valley and backed up on either sides, and these trees stood up on the banks with these big rooting systems, and the whole thing had a sort of twist to it to give some structure. And it was probably about 20 foot up or 15 foot up, and he had, on a crane, had tracked down both sides of the set in a very, very wide lens.
But this amazing set wouldn't last through the entire production, because with only 10 days left to film, the set would burn down in the middle of the day.
So I'm in the editing room and I hear this pitter-patter down the corridor. Came back and said, the Bond stage is on fire. So I walked out down the corridor, and as I got to the end, I could see over the buildings this giant column of smoke, like a battleship was sinking or an aircraft carrier.
Thankfully, no one was hurt as they were on break for lunch, but the cast and the crew would look on as the gas cylinders they had stored inside the building started to explode.
I walked up to the car park, and there's the whole fire brigade. Then there's already 3 television helicopters up there photographing it. And all my gas bottles were exploding inside the studio, so they had steel corrugated walls. So every time a bottle went, the walls ballooned. It's kind of beautiful. And the fireman said, "Is this yours?" And I said, "Yeah."
Now, you might be asking what exactly caused this fire. Well, they had been using gas fires to light the campfire for a scene, because they had been using a lot of gas throughout this shoot. It's estimated that it had built up at the top of the roof over time and finally just caught on fire. Whether that's a spark from a pilot light or whatever, they're not really fully sure.
And I went immediately, and because this is what I always do, it's like Zen, I went and played tennis. So Arnold Milchan knew in 15 minutes the bomb station. This was like 5 a.m. in LA. And Arnold had called up saying, "Where's Ridley?" They said, "He's got to play tennis."
To finish out the film, the art department would rebuild part of the forest in another location. They would film another section in a garden outside of Shepperton Studios and then fly over to Florida to Silver Springs for the underwater scenes. But I know you have to be wondering at this point, what could possibly be worse than burning down one of the largest studios in the world? It had been 15 years since the Legend incident, and though Ridley Scott had played around with some fire sequences in Thelma and Louise, and in his other film, 1492 Conquest of Fire, Ridley Scott was bored and looking to fulfill that pyromaniac urge inside of him. He had to do something big. So he took on a film about a gladiator just to satiate the need to burn. And that right there is a Ridley Scott historical truth. That's just absolutely how it happened and why Gladiator was made.
When the historian goes, "Sorry, Sir Ridley, it didn't quite happen like that," you go, "Listen, I've done enough with you.
Well,
you have to have artistic license,
I would say, how did you know? Were you there?
Anyways, to open up the film, Ridley Scott would conjure up one of the most iconic openings in cinema history. This was a massive undertaking, and figuring out how to shoot everything he needed with so many people running around to simulate the battle sequences was its own headache. To get all of these shots down, they would employ a fairly new filming technique in which they would aim at showing off the emotions of the fight rather than a more chronological cut through the battle. Composed using hundreds of different camera shots with a choppy skip frame technique. The fight sequences in Gladiator represent a breathtaking technical advance upon combat scenes in earlier movies that were filmed in a single wide-angle shot. And some of this might look familiar to you, and we covered this in our first Gladiator film, about how they borrowed a bunch of different cinematic techniques from Saving Private Ryan.
You start off with a huge bang, and probably one of the longest sequences in the whole movie. And it's all in mud and filth and battle. Every film has its own difficulties built into it. And it's how far you allow those difficulties get through the door and start to control you. This wasn't difficult, it was enjoyable.
This battle would challenge even the main actor, Russell Crowe, who would come away with multiple injuries. But the big battle visuals, new filmmaking techniques, and heroics just weren't enough for Ridley Scott. He saw the need for another element, and not water, wind, earth, or lightning, but fire. Yeah, I think you got that at this point. Ridley Scott somehow fell into the perfect opportunity to set a forest on fire for this film.
The Forestry Commission wanted to lose some forest, so I said, "I'll do it, I'll burn it to the ground." They said, "Good." So I had 400 meters of forest I could burn and do what I wanted.
Yeah, that's right. Ridley Scott would save the good people of England some tax money by handling the removal of a forest they were about to take down anyways. After Gladiator, though, Ridley Scott would forego his practical burning of sets and forests and trade it in for CGI fire. Of course, he'd bring back the Flamethrower for his Alien sequel Prometheus, and the jury is out about Gladiator 2. But speaking of Gladiator and Gladiator 2, if you're interested in knowing more about those productions, how they came together and the entire history behind them, you can check out those videos right here.